What also happens is when you're a successful executive, which many board qualified people are, you're used to getting the phone calls for your next thing. They come in and you say no to a bunch of them. Maybe every once in a while you say yes to one. That's not really how the board ecosystem works. I think that's why so many people are focused on public companies, because they are the ones we read about. They are the ones we're familiar with, and they are very important. But what's harder to understand is all those private companies that you really can't find very easily, right? They may not be in the news, or you may not be able to learn a whole lot about them. And that's why when we say networking into the board ecosystem,
today we are welcoming to Sundays with Renee, Jocelyn Mangan. And, Jocelyn is a really visionary leader who has dedicated so much of her time and energy into really diversifying boards. Welcome, Jocelyn. We're so grateful to have you here with us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
We do our shorter versions of our Sundays with Renee because we want to get people to hear about fabulous people like yourself who are doing these really interesting, innovative initiatives that can really make a huge difference when it comes to creating inclusive, fair, and equitable organizations. And I wanted to hear you talk about what you're doing and how you even started. What inspired you to start these organizations? And if you could just tell folks, what are the goals, specific goals? I said a little bit about that in the introduction, but how do you see the goals?
Yeah. So where did this come from? How did I start this? It's a great question. I spent my whole life in tech as an operator. And in 2016, I was invited into a fellowship out of the Aspen Institute called Henry Crown. And part of that fellowship inspires people to think about, what more could you be doing in the world to make it a better place, right? Just that big question. And I really wanted to do something around the space of women at work. I was born in New Orleans, raised in Texas. Still a little bit of an anomaly that I've had a career and wanted to see more women have a career, and I've enjoyed my career. But when I really looked at that space, and you have this kind of theory of change the world, I wanted to start at the top, and the top is the boardroom. And, I grew up in product management, which really trains you to go learn about your customers. So I went and interviewed 100 board members to learn more. And I learned two things that really shape still how we approach things today, which is every single person I talked to wanted to see different people in the boardroom, wanted to broaden their networks so that their companies could be stronger. They just didn't really know where to start. But the second aha that was a big one for me was when I asked, well, where did you find your last board member? And I heard back 100 versions of a personal network story. And that was really what helped us start the company. A big portion of those were private dinners, no surprise. And so I said, well, why don't we have a private dinner and just invite different people? And we had a very notable host at that private dinner, Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit. He called me right after and said, we have a problem. So many people said, yes, we have to do two. I'm proud to say tonight is number 177 in 6 years. It's certainly not all we do as an organization. I'll talk a little bit about what more we do, but it's a foundational experience because we're bringing thought leaders together who don't know each other already. We're doing a moderated off the record conversation. So it's a real memorable evening. And then we're sharing everyone's information afterwards. And through that, we've grown this incredible network. We have over 8,000 board qualified women in our network. Over a third of those are women of color. Increasingly, we're adding men of color to that network. And they've all been referred by the business community. So we're not a membership organization. People aren't filling out an application or paying to be a part of this. These are business leaders, men, women, saying, look, you should know these people. These people should be on boards. And I think that's such a great data point. And then the second piece of what we do just quickly is that's great. I can build talent, but it's not great if you don't build opportunities. And that's the hardest part of the board landscape, in my view, which is the opportunities for board seats don't live on websites. They're not open jobs you apply for. They also live in these kind of word of mouth networks mostly in the minds of CEOs, investors, and board members. And so unless you're in that world, it's really hard to find an opportunity. So nothing like your executive career, right? Where you want this next role, you go find it, you apply for it, you get it or you don't. This is a very different world. And that's why we spend a lot of time kind of demystifying it for people to help them understand it's different so that they can find those opportunities. And how we do that is we've been lucky to partner with over 100 private equity and venture capital firms where we're just constantly making introductions to great talent they don't know. So it's been a win-win.
Yeah. I mean, networking and relationship building is everything. And it's almost invisible if you are not
Right.
part of it, right? The
Yeah.
invisibility of what makes it possible for people to actually access these kinds of amazing opportunities. And it's not just obviously for the folks who are trying to become board members. Tell us about why boards should even care about having access to these individuals.
Yeah, boards have a hard job. Their job is to oversee a company without operating it, right? So they're in this. They have a lot of responsibility in the sense that they have fiduciary responsibility for the company, and yet they're not there to set a 3-year goal or sorry, a 3-month goal and achieve it like you do if you get a new CMO job, for example. And so this overseer versus operator mentality is quite powerful. Boards need to see around corners, which, I don't have to explain to you or anyone listening to this. It's really hard to do that these days. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot going on inside of companies. Companies are made of people, and people are what are building the things inside the companies. And so the reason you want what I would call cognitive diversity on your boards is so that you have a better chance of seeing around corners, so that you're not privy to groupthink, which flies in the face of innovation, flies in the face of progress and growth. And so it is the right financial reason to have different people on your boards who have different backgrounds, different experiences, to have seen around different corners, whether that's different industries or different stages of companies. Every board needs something different because boards are ecosystems where, they're made up of the people who have the board seats, which typically are formed by the investors and the founder, the CEO. And so their first opportunity to add someone new is in what we call the independent director, right? And so oftentimes they're asking, well, what is our company strategy in the next 3 years? And therefore, what could we use on our
Who do
board?
we
And
need? Who's not
that's
here?
right.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right. And sometimes that's industry, sometimes that's scaling experience, sometimes that's functional experience. So the good news is there's a wide range of criteria that boards are looking for, which means, when people say, well, what does it mean to be board qualified? That's also a wide range, and I say the simplest way of saying it is you need to have amassed enough operating experience to guide a CEO of our company. But remember, some of the boards we're helping are seed stage or Series A companies. And that's very different from, Fortune 50.
Yeah, well, that's what I was gonna ask you, if you could just distinguish for people, like, are you doing public boards? Are you doing private boards? Like, what stage, is the company in that you, make these connections with?
So we help any company that's for profit, and that's seed stage all the way to Fortune 50. So we're helping both private and public companies. However, what people don't realize, there are far more private companies than there are public. In fact, today in the US, there's roughly 5,600 public companies, about half of what they were at their height. There's, hundreds of thousands of private companies, many of them of significant revenue, over 100 million in revenue. So there's just a huge opportunity. And, one of the things we think about too, the Magnificent Seven all started as venture-backed startups. So there's a lot of startups, especially with the rise of AI being built right now. We don't know who's going to be the next, Meta or Apple or Tesla, because they're all in these private companies. And so that's where I would say the lion's share of our work is, but it's just because that's where the sheer number of opportunities are.
Do you wanna tell us who the Magnificent Seven are?
Yeah, so those are there's like a keyword for some of the most valuable companies and stocks. So the ones that you read about, right? And I think that's why so many people are focused on public companies, because they are the ones we read about. They are the ones we're familiar with, and they are very important. Um, but what's harder to understand is all those private companies that you really can't find very easily, right? They may not be in the news, or you may not be able to learn a whole lot about them. And that's why when we say networking into the board ecosystem, it's very important to network into the investor community, the CEOs of those companies or the sitting board members of those companies, because they are the ones that are in the know about not only those companies, but when they're looking for a board member.
Yeah. So you said you have had how many dinners?
So we've had 177, what we call roundtables. Now, I'll be honest, some of those were during the pandemic, so they weren't, they were virtual. But yes, we've had 177 as of tonight. We do them around the country. We do them in Europe, and they're a way to, in an authentic way, broaden the network and extend relationships in the business community. And we've seen that happen at scale.
You said that it's a pretty significant uh, roundtable event. What makes it such? I mean, the conversations you said are very, very compelling. How do you manage to create great conversations, important conversations with people who are really strangers until they sit down at that table?
Yeah, I borrowed some of it from what I learned in Aspen, which is, a one table conversation is powerful. So we cap the number so we can all fit at one table. We open up the evening with a question that everybody answers. So everyone at the table's voice is equal, even though we always have a notable host. But the host isn't there to talk at the table. The host is really there to get the right people to the table. And then the topics are interesting. And by the way, people are interesting and their stories are interesting. And so, right now, no surprise, a lot of our topics are around AI, what boards should be thinking about, what they should be asking about. And there's no shortage of conversation there. But over the years, we've varied the conversation. Imagine how interesting it was during the pandemic when every company was dealing with the pandemic in different ways. We've also asked the question, who's been your most valuable board member and why? But I think there's something about a moderated one table conversation that's thoughtful, that feels different than your average quote unquote business dinner. And when you can get a group of people who, you're right, if we've done our job right, most of them are strangers to one another, to kind of, the off the record nature brings out that authenticity. And then people become interested and they want to follow up with people. And then that's actually, again, I borrowed this from my research. When I heard people say, I found my board member at a private dinner, I thought, that is a good, breaking bread, sipping wine and conversation, it doesn't get old.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you find these people to come to these tables and make these connections with the larger companies?
Yeah, so the network started to build itself. So when I mentioned, 8,000 board qualified, it's over 15,000 of total executives who are now engaged in our work. And so when we construct our roundtables, we're very thoughtful about bringing talent, people who want board work with opportunity. And that those are specifically those personas I mentioned, the investors, the CEOs, and the board members. So when we're building our tables, it's always equal of both talent and opportunity, and that's intentional, right? Because we want from those conversations for relationships to form and opportunities to get revealed, and that does happen.
Mm. So what would you say some of your successes have been thus far? Like, do you have a set of milestones? How are you sort of measuring your success in this work?
I mean, our ultimate success is, are we landing people in board seats they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, right? But we are measuring the long tail in between, and it is a long tail. Board seats are rarely urgent. It's not like people leave this dinner with a job offer. They're very relationship driven. They're very trust driven. And so we're very digital. We track every introduction we've made. So we've made thousands and thousands of introductions, which I'm very happy to say. I'd say some of our successes are getting 100 venture capital and private equity firms to work with us in partnership. I'd say, we're nearing 200 women sitting on boards direct through our introductions. That is a success. I want that number to be thousands, of course. But those are direct opportunities that we've been able to connect. So we're proud of that. We're proud of the fact that we are making introductions on a daily basis, not just for the board openings, but for advisory roles, for speaking engagements, for attending events that maybe people wouldn't have been invited to otherwise. I should have mentioned this, but our corporate program was built because we saw this need for people inside some of those larger companies, like Google, like Netflix, the large pharma companies. They have these executives who are just doing incredible work. And they're hard to find because maybe their title doesn't have a C. Maybe they don't even know about private equity or venture capital. They've been at this organization for 20 plus years. And yet these private companies could really use their experience, could really use their scaling experience. And so we built a program specifically for those people inside those corporations. And that was a success because it was kind of one of those ahas that we realized along the journey.
And that's certainly how you and I got more
Yeah.
associated, right, with this through the corporate program. And what I recognize also is that lots of people are working so hard. And like you're right, they're incredibly talented, but they have their heads down and they're really,
That's right.
completely consumed by everything they're doing. And they really haven't thought much further than the next day. But a lot of what you have shared with me and that you're sharing with people who come in your program and connect with you is that this may be something that's 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, but it's important to start thinking about building those relationships and making those connections while you're still like at a day-to-day corporate job. You may not be there in 5 years. I mean, you may want to be somewhere else and you need to sort of get yourself ready. So tell us more about like what people need to be thinking about. The other thing, Jocelyn, that I know as women, we often don't think of ourselves as the people who should be on boards. We're starting to become more thoughtful about that and more interested, but we almost take ourselves out of the running by just perception that, self-perception that we wouldn't be good enough or they're not looking for people like me or whatever. So help us sort of people to understand like where they might be thinking incorrectly about boards.
Yeah. So I spend most of my time telling people who are qualified, they're qualified, not the other way around, to your point. And I think the reason is, when you look at a board, depending on where you sit in your organization, so let's just pretend you sit at Netflix, that's a pretty prestigious board there. Alphabet, pretty prestigious board. So it's kind of hard to think, wow, I'm ready for that. Right. But what people don't realize is what I've said before, which is the long tail of private companies that you're actually ready to serve on today. Right. So I would also challenge those in the audience who are like, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's not. Because, someone said to us at one of our roundtables the other night, if your board doesn't have an operator on it, they're at a distinct disadvantage. And that you can understand how that's true, right? The operating environment has changed drastically within the last, 5-10 years. And so if your whole board has been out of operating for that period of time, that actually might be the thing they are looking for, someone who is currently operating. So that remember, they're always looking for the thing they don't have. Remember that your job is to guide a CEO in a company that could be a 30-person startup. Right. So when you're thinking about, have I amassed enough operating experience to guide a CEO, to guide a company, don't always picture the Fortune 50 as your bar, because that's actually not representative of most of the opportunities out there. And so that's why we also built this corporate program, because you're right. So many people are working on their job and not thinking about their career. Or let's say they really love their job and they are thinking about their career, but there's nowhere to go this year in that company because you're already at the top. A board role is a great way to broaden your career while you're still in an operating role. By the way, it also makes you a better operator because you bring all that thinking back into your operating world. And, some of the things that make great board members are also just great leadership skills. Right. So I do think it's such a great thing for people's career. And what also happens is when you're a successful executive, which many board qualified people are, you're used to getting the phone calls for your next thing. they come in and you say no to a bunch of them. Maybe every once in a while you say yes to one. That's not really how the board ecosystem works. So what can also happen is when those phone calls aren't coming in, people can wrongly assume, not yet, not ready, when actually it's just a little bit of a misunderstanding of the ecosystem, which is what we're here to do, which is to demystify that, which is to say, look, there aren't a lot of phone calls going around, right? What's happening is this word of mouth behavior. And so what you really have to do is strangely, you have to be proactive with boards, which maybe you haven't had to do with your career. And being proactive in the board space doesn't mean that you're not qualified or that you're not wanted in the boardroom. It just means you have to navigate into the ecosystem. It's not going to phone call, it's not going to be a series of phone calls into you. And I'm not saying there aren't some people who do get lots of phone calls for board seats, but most people I talk to don't. And many of those people end up finding a board seat, but they don't do it because they got a bunch of phone calls. They do it because they strategically networked into those personas, CEOs, investors, and board members, let them know of their interest in adding board service to their career, and then was just asked to be kept top of mind. And then those opportunities started to come.
So that's interesting. So to be proactive, you're saying, who are you speaking to? Like if you're just like, you know what, I really want a board seat and I think I'll be really good. What's your first couple of steps? And how do they reach out to you, by the way?
Yeah, so that's right. So a few things. We work on people's behalf, right? But I always say to people, if I had $100 million and 10 million people on staff, I still couldn't get access to all the opportunities. There's no centralized source, right? So we will also work on your behalf. And we are at illumynimpact.org and illumyn.co is how you get to us. But remember the power that you also have in your own network. And to be very specific, we actually have an article about this. I don't mean like put on a name tag and walk around a cocktail party. I mean, you could do that, but I think the more kind of focused approach is to make a list of those CEOs, sitting board members, and investors that are in your network already, who already know you. Reach out to them. Say, hey, I'm interested in adding boards to my journey, my career. You may have to remind them what it is you bring aboard. And we also have an article on the 6 dimensions of expertise, which we can share. And then ask them to keep you top of mind. And don't forget, if any of you are sitting on nonprofit boards, look around the table. There's often people who are one of these personas I mentioned, and they're already serving with you on a board. They already are watching you be awesome. And yet, they may not know that you want to add for-profit board work to your portfolio. So that would be I think the clearest way and the clearest path. And I know this because I would talk to people who've done it and it works, right? And within a couple of months, they're in interviews. And the other reason I know it is in my research, when I was researching these 100 board members, every single person was like, how can I help? So the people who know you and who know that you're awesome at work want to help you with your career. They do. But in this case, you just need to ask, which may be a little bit different from what you've had to do lately in your career.
Yeah, that's interesting because also people, even though you may not be tapped and you may not be getting those phone calls, some people who are asked all the time, do you know any good board people who could be on our board?
That's right.
Absolutely. So there, I know that when you first started, this was called him for her. Yeah. And it
Yes.
seems that we've got a recent name change. So can you tell me a little bit about why that is?
Yeah. So when I started this in 2016, I was doing my research. It was the height of Me Too. There was a lot of press out there that was negative towards men, and many, terrible stories that we've all read. When I was doing my research, all the people I talked to were men, because that is most board members, and they all wanted to help. They were all trying to find ways to get this project off the ground. And so I named it out of that reality. And my own career, I'd only had male managers and bosses who gave me so many great opportunities. And so, that was really what it was. And it was a project at the time, which just became a company, became what I do full time. And when we started the corporate program, we really went through what I would call classic branding exercise to get to the word Illumyn. And the reason for Illumyn was about illuminating voices, illuminating talent that really at the end of the day is just under networked. they're just under networked into this very closed network. And so it made a lot of sense as a name. And then what we wanted to do was create, look, we have a nonprofit, we have for profit, but they serve the same mission, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a good point. One is that I remember so many like really well-intentioned white men who would say to me, well, we just can't find the talent. We just can't find the talent. And for a long time, Jocelyn, I was like, right? 'Cause I'm like, really? Because I know some fabulous people. But ultimately, I started to believe them because
Yeah.
because it's true, their network is so limited.
That's right.
It's really reflective of like where their comfort is and where their relationships are and where they hang out. So it's not like they're bad people and it's not like they're lying. It's just that all of us kind of, not all of us, many of us have very homogeneous networks that reflect us, you know?
That's right.
Some of us have had to create much more heterogeneous networks in order to survive. And also just where we went to school and so forth, we were often the minorities. And so we actually have a very extensive network, but that isn't true often for folks who are in majority groups. And so I started to really believe that. And I think what your group is doing is also sort of believing that people want to know more people and they need help to actually facilitate broader networks. I was talking to the firm management and the head of this management committee when I was explaining to him, you know, you have like 10 people and the majority of them are men, and you really need to think about diversifying your committee, um, especially around gender diversity, because you have a number of women who are ready to go, but they somehow can, you know, do well and elevate up until right here. Right here is where it starts to cut off. And he asked me a question that he was quite earnest about. He said, why would it make a difference to have women on our board? Like, women and men aren't different. So why should I worry about that? And, you know, for me, I was like surprised because I was like, you don't have any idea of how bringing women on board on this committee would change the committee in some respects. Like I took him very seriously. What would you say to a person who's saying, "Why do we need women?"
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a question that I think you'd answer differently depending on who's asking it. I'm reflecting on a conversation I was a part of a week ago. Very notable investor, and he said, "Look, the reason I put women on my boards is they are buying our products. They are the majority of the consumer who are buying our products, and so for me, it would be a terrible business decision to think." That we could have boards of these companies where the consumers are largely women and there are no women represented at the board level. Now, that was his answer, and it resonated a little bit when you were talking, because I'm wondering, not knowing what this company is or who this person is, like,
Yeah.
if you really think about the purchasing power, like if you just take it down to the economics of who's buying things, it gets a lot more interesting, right? And then I think there's another population we're not talking about, which is your employee population, which is also a really critical population for a company because they're the ones who are working to build the things that you represent. And so I would ask questions around those populations just to get curious.
Hmm.
And I do think curiosity is a good tool in some of this dialogue because it is interesting to think how he might think that's different or not different. And then maybe even thinking about an environment where he could hear how it is different for some of his female employees. I think that's been a powerful thing I've seen done in the past where, I've seen men genuinely surprised by what women have said when they're asked the question. And so I think, it's like anything, proximity is a great teacher, right?
Yeah, it works really well when you're not proximate because you can't conceive that someone would have a different perspective or add
Yeah.
a different value if you've been making all the decisions all the time and you haven't had an opportunity to hear something different. You presume that you're the brightest and the most capable and the most qualified and that you don't really need that input. I mean, these are successful companies, right? And we
Right.
certainly have had women consumers for a really long time. And they're, a lot of companies are like, well, we've been doing fine. We've been doing excellently, actually. I'm not sure why we should actually worry about the representation. And so I think that is sometimes still an obstacle as we try to bring people together. Uh, and that's why I think what you're doing is so powerful. Because really what you're doing is increasing proximity. You're like bringing people
Yeah.
together, breaking bread, having conversations. And I'm sure, like in those moments, individuals are sitting around that table going, oh, I actually would not have thought about that. Right. And
Yeah,
that
it's funny.
begins the curiosity. Yeah.
People have said, like, how do you get all these amazing how is that like, you know what? Smart business people always want to extend their networks with other smart people. They usually just don't have time to do it.
Yes.
Right. I mean, that's actually another big barrier is let's be honest, people like to put people on their board who they already know and trust because it's a tough room. You're dealing with tough circumstances. Many people are sitting on boards over a decade and a lot of stuff happens in the world in a decade. And so it might feel like the right thing to do to put someone you already know and trust to your right or to your left when it could be one of the riskiest things you can do. Right. If you're not getting the see around the corners benefit from other perspectives. And so I get why it works the way it does. And I think what you're saying is really true. We're actually just putting more people in the network. So when they say next time, who do we know? They know Vernay, they know
Yes.
Jocelyn, which maybe they didn't before. And I think that's the kind of more the broader mission of what we're doing and then how we're measuring it. Obviously, we're very goal oriented is okay, how many people got the sheets, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And they can say, I've seen her, I've talked with her. She's
Yeah.
really awesome, right? And that's huge because you need people to vouch for you as well. Well, thank you so much, Jocelyn, for coming and sharing
Thanks
so
for
much
having
of what
me.
you're doing. I really appreciate all your efforts and I wish you the very best.
Thank you, Renee.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to follow me at Vernay Myers on Instagram and Twitter. You can also listen to my podcast on Spotify and Apple Music. Subscribe to my channel and share this episode with someone who is going to join us in this space. Make sure to visit my website for DEI resources and online learning courses at vernaymyers.com. And make sure you sign up for my newsletter to stay in touch with me. Thank you again for listening and see you next time for more Sundays with Vernay.